Okay, let's start. Welcome to attend Professor Williamson's 6 lectures. The title of this lecture is Philosophy and Logic. Very interesting topic. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about the relation between philosophy and logic today. And I think that for many analytic philosophers, it seems that clear that there's a very close relation between philosophy and logic. But I don't think it's as easy as people sometimes seem to assume to explain just what this close relationship is. So I think one thing that you find, especially amongst analytic philosophers, is that they often insist that their analytic approach is distinctive because they argue for their views. They don't just assert them. But the question is, what kind of argument have they in mind? And I think typically they have something like a deductive model of philosophical argument in the back of their mind, with clearly identified premises and conclusion, each of them identified by a single sentence which expresses them. And, sometimes, of course, you even find the premises and conclusion actually numbered or labeled in some way. Sometimes they're just there in a block of prose, but it's usually pretty clear what they are. And typically the argument is a valid one in a deductive sense. So the conclusion logically follows from the premises. So that, as it were, in some sense, you couldn't have the premises being true without the conclusion being true. And I mean, often this logical validity, this deductive validity, is achieved in a very simple way, which is that you start off with some premises, and if they are not logically sufficient for the conclusion by themselves, then you just add an extra premise of the form, well, if the other premises hold, then the conclusion holds, and then that premise, together with the other ones, will give you the conclusion in a logically valid way. So, in a sense, it's relatively easy to attain this kind of logical validity. And then once you've got an argument like that, there are going to be very few philosophers who will challenge the validity of an argument with that kind of form. I mean, it's not exactly that none have challenged it. I mean, the underlying kind of rule of inference that we're talking about is usually known as Modus Ponens. So it's the form of inference that takes us from a premise P and another premise, if P then Q, to the conclusion Q. And an example of a philosopher, I mean, indeed a logician, who's challenged the validity of Modus Ponens is Van McGee, particularly for conditionals where you've got one conditional embedded inside another. So you've got something like if P, then if Q, then R, or something like that. And then dialetheists like Graham Priest, who think that there are true contradictions, that they often challenge modus ponens for material conditionals, where if P then Q is just equivalent to either not P or Q, because that's how they avoid contradictions leading to everything. So there are people who challenge that form of argument, but they're very much in a minority. And even for people who do challenge it, there may well be ways of securing the validity of a philosophical argument in a way that they would accept in some slightly different way, perhaps. And I mean, it doesn't seem that the philosophical arguments all need to take exactly the form that Van McGee rejects, or I mean, you might try using a different kind of conditional to get the implication from premises to conclusion. So, if there's a philosopher who wants to challenge the conclusion of a valid argument, which they accept as valid, then it seems that what they've got to do is to challenge the premises, and they're expected to do that in a specific way. They're expected to say which premise they're challenging. And of course, if there's only one premise, then it's obvious that it's that one they have to challenge. But if there are many premises, then they have to say which of those that they're challenging. I should say that there is one special case which I'm not haven't allowed for in the way I've stated this, which is that sometimes you might have an empty set of premises. I mean, you might have no premises, and then the conclusion will simply be a logical truth. I think that there are things to say about that, which some of what I say later will be relevant to, but I don't think we need to worry very much about that case for present purposes, because it's relatively rare in philosophical discussion that the conclusion of the argument we're concerned with is just a simple logical truth. Usually, it's not an ordinary logical truth, and there are some explicit premises which are being assumed. So we'll be concentrating on that case. This expectation that the philosopher says which premise they're challenging is not completely self-evident why it's legitimate, because it seems that you could just say, well, each premise by itself is plausible, but their conjunction is not plausible. And I mean, there are cases where that actually seems like the reasonable thing to do. So suppose that a die has been cast. So it's a die with the 6 faces, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And suppose that we don't know what the outcome was. Then if we're given an argument like the one that I'm displaying, where we've got the premises: the die did not come up 1, the die did not come up 2, it didn't come up 3, it didn't come up 4, it didn't come up 5, but it did come up either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Then from those, we can validly deduce that it came up 6. And the premises are all highly probable, right? Because for any particular outcome, it's probable that it didn't come up that way. So in fact, the first 5 premises, each of them has a probability of 5 out of 6, but then the conclusion has a probability of just 1 out of 6. In fact, we could even have added some as an extra premise that the die did not come up 6, and then got a contradiction as a conclusion. So it's not the case that that if you have an argument, each of whose premises is highly probable, then the conclusion is highly probable. Of course, this is just something that we're familiar with from lottery paradoxes. And if we were actually presented with this argument, it wouldn't in the situation where we didn't know which way the die had come up, then it would not be reasonable for us to say which premise we thought was false, because we just don't know. But at the same time, when we're probably not going to accept the conclusion because it's not very likely that the die came up 6. So in the case of philosophical argument, we're not supposed just to leave it at a general doubt about the premises. Typically, the person who's challenging the argument is expected to nominate one premise for a challenge, and then the dispute continues with respect to that premise. And so this is actually, if you like, a kind of rule of the logic game as played by philosophers, quite similar to rules that I was discussing in lecture 2. So, as it were, in order to have a productive discussion, the challenger is expected to decide which premise to focus their doubts on. And of course, although it may be very hard to say which premise you're confident is false, as in the die case, it's usually quite easy to find a premise which is not obviously correct. And that's especially the case when we've got an argument with a philosophically interesting conclusion. And then the philosopher who's attacking the argument, I mean, they don't need to insist that premise must be false, but they can just say, I see no reason to accept that premise. And then that's supposed to block the argument. Now, of course, following the rules of the logic game, the defender can give a deductive argument for the disputed premise. But I mean, the disputed premise is it's going to be similar. It's also not going to be a logical truth in normal cases, and then the deductive argument that's given for that disputed premise will itself contain premises which are not logical truths, are not completely obvious, and then the attacker can challenge one of those. And so we're obviously facing the danger of an infinite regress, that we just continue with these further arguments and further challenges without really getting anywhere very much. And I think what this makes clear is that the deductive story can't be the whole story. I mean, it may well be part of the story. That this deductive argument may have some role to play in explaining the support for the conclusion, but it can't be sufficient just by itself because of this obvious problem of the regress of justification. And it doesn't really seem plausible in most of these cases that the defender of the argument will just be able to say that the premises are self-evident. And in fact, it will be difficult for them to say that if their opponent is actually challenging the premises. So we could go in a different direction, and the defender of the argument could try supporting each premise of the deductive argument with its own abductive argument. So we'd have, as it were, the overall structure would be a deductive argument with a number of premises, and then for each of those premises, there would be a supporting abductive argument. But doing things that way is not really in the spirit of abduction, because abduction is trying to achieve some kind of unified position, which then supports the things that follow from it, and so on. And it could be that the kind of abductive support that we gave for one premise of the deductive argument might not cohere with the abductive support for another premise. And it might even be that that things that we were saying in one case seem to be inconsistent with things that we were saying in support of another one. So that it seems that it would be more in the abductive spirit to find abductive support for the premises together to show that they fit into a unified picture. Now, if that happens, it doesn't mean that the deduction was useless. It can still help us clarify the logical space of specific alternatives to the conclusion, in part because different alternatives will correspond to denying different premises of the deduction. So that we can, as it were, we've got a kind of a way of mapping out what the alternatives to the conclusion are in terms of which a premise they reject, or possibly even a rejection of the validity of the deduction. So, I mean, that at least gives us a better sense of the geography of the relevant region of logical space, something like that. Now, thinking of these arguments in terms of combinations of deduction and abduction, the problem that we had with the pure deductive model was that it generates an infinite regress of deductive arguments. But we could say, well, moving to abductive support in combination with deduction doesn't really help us in this structural problem, because it's going to face a similar problem. It will generate an infinite regress of abductive arguments, because the abductive arguments will themselves have premises, and then we have to support those premises, and so on. So that you might fear that we haven't really made much progress. Just to be a bit more specific about that, the premises of the abductive argument, they will be the sorts of pieces of evidence which the abductive conclusion is supposed to explain or unify, or however we exactly understand abductive argument. But then if those pieces of evidence are challenged, then, as I say, then we might need abductive arguments for them too. Now, that isn't quite as strong a worry as you might think. But one reason for that is that in practice, the premises of an abductive argument, in other words, these pieces of evidence to be explained or whatever exactly it is, they may be much weaker in the logical sense than the premises of a deductive argument for the same conclusion. So, for example, supposing we're interested in the conclusion of the form all F's are G's. If you have a valid deductive argument for a universal conclusion like that, in a case where it really is essentially of universal form, typically you're going to require some kind of universal premise to get the universality of the conclusion, and so that a universal premise will look like a vulnerable one to be challenged. But if we're dealing with an abductive argument, then maybe for the same conclusion, then the abductive argument can often make do with non-universal premises. And for example, if we were dealing with a simple case of induction, then the non-universal premises might just be of the form this F is a G. And so that makes it easier to find premises for an abductive argument which the target audience accepts. So it's not that the premises of an abductive argument will typically be intrinsically undeniable or anything. That seems far too high a standard to expect. But they may be premises which, although they're not, as it were, self-evident, that they're ones which, as a matter of fact, the target audience, as with the audience that we're trying to convince, accepts. And if the people that we're trying to convince actually accept the premises, then it doesn't matter that the premises are not undeniable. I mean, at least insofar as we're concerned with this particular discussion with this particular audience. Of course, it's also sometimes true that one can find premises for a deductive argument which the target audience accepts for the given conclusion. But it's going to be much harder if we're dealing with a somewhat skeptical audience to find enough premises to give you a deductive argument for the conclusion, all of which they accept. The prospects for doing that are much better if we're just trying to give them an abductive argument for the conclusion. Now, another kind of objection, of course, which could arise, and in fact sometimes does arise, we might be dealing with an opponent who rejects abduction itself. And there are such philosophers. In the philosophy of science, an opponent of abduction and inference to the best explanation has been Bas van Fraassen. And in a more limited way, you even find that with the contemporary metaphysician Ted Sider, I think he's willing to accept abductive forms of argument in fundamental metaphysics. But I mean, he thinks that the workability of abduction in those cases has to do with the fact that you're dealing with, as it were, very, very natural joints in nature or something of that kind. And he's much more skeptical about the cogency of abduction in non-fundamental areas. For example, let's say as used by a detective or something like that. So this is, I mean, the possibility of philosophers who just reject abduction it's a real possibility. Now, sometimes what's going on in those cases is that these philosophers who reject abduction, that it's that they want to understand non-deductive argument in a somewhat different way. So if you give them what would naturally be described as an abductive argument. In some cases, they will accept it, but they will rationalize it in a different way. For example, in Van Frassen's case, he might sometimes rationalize it by using some kind of probabilistic argument. And so the fact that they reject abduction by itself doesn't mean that they will reject every argument which a friend of abduction would describe as abductive. So that as well, there's some kind of room for maneuver here sometimes. But we might also be dealing with a much more extreme philosopher who systematically rejects abductive arguments and isn't offering any kind of non-deductive alternatives to them. And I'm afraid that at some point, we may be dealing with somebody who's just too close to rejecting rational argument altogether to be worth arguing with. I mean, there's going to be a point where we encounter somebody like that in principle. Because after all, you can have a skeptic about reason who simply denies that that anything is a good reason for anything else. And then if you try to persuade him by giving him good reasons for thinking that there are good reasons, he will just reject that as question begging. He'll say, "Well, you're giving me reasons, but my whole position is that there aren't any good reasons. So obviously, I'm not going to be moved by any kind of considerations." And so it seems that if we were dealing with an absolutely extreme kind of skeptic about reason of that kind, there's nothing that we could do from a philosophical point in dealing with them. I mean, of course, we could ask them whether they had good reasons for their position, but they might just say no. But I don't expect there to be any good reasons for any positions. And here we're considering not someone who rejects all reasoning whatsoever. In this particular case, you might be dealing just with somebody who rejects non-deductive reasoning, but it's still going to be very difficult to get anywhere in a discussion with such a person. Of course, as I say, we can say, if supposing that they only like deductive arguments, they only accept deductive arguments. I mean, they won't be able to give a purely deductive argument for rejecting abduction. I mean, they might be able to show that the abduction is not, they might be able to show deductively that the abduction is not deductive, but that doesn't mean that they can show that deductively that any non-deductive argument should be rejected. I mean, you can't just derive that by deduction. So, as I say, they won't be able to give strong reasons for their own view. Though the fact that they can't give them, that doesn't provide a purely deductive argument against their position either. But it definitely seems that at some point we're running up against people who are so restrictive in their view of what counts as a cogent argument or cogent reasons for a conclusion or whatever, that there is just no point discussing things with them anymore. And I think we just have to live with the fact that sometimes we will get into that position. Of course, I mean, philosophers are an extremely accommodating on the whole. I mean, they tend to want to find ways of persuading an opponent, no matter how distant the opponent is from them. But I think just by considering what kinds of skepticism are available, are conceivable, it's pretty clear that we're not going to be able to find ways of making any inroads with some of these opponents, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's something defective about our position. It's just that for relatively trivial reasons, it's inevitable that we're not going to be able to persuade every kind of opponent, and we shouldn't be judging views by whether they can have this capacity, which in fact is, if it's meant to be a universal one, it's just completely unreasonable to expect. And so that, as we're trying to insist on such a all-purpose dialectical capacity would really just be consigning ourselves to skepticism. And here, although we're not dealing with such an extreme form of skepticism about reasoning, we're dealing with something which is fairly close to it. And I think that we probably have to accept that if we're dealing with somebody who doesn't think that any kind of reasoning except deductive reasoning is acceptable as a way of supporting a conclusion, then we probably have reached the point where there isn't much to be said. So I mean, even if in principle they claim to accept rational but non-deductive arguments, I mean, they might say that then they're not restricting themselves to deductive arguments. But if we find that in practice they normally reject any particular rational arguments they're confronted with, they may still not be worth arguing with. And some skeptics are like that. They'd say, well, if you give me, if you give me a rational argument, I'll be delighted to accept it. But then whatever arguments you give them, that they dismiss as not rational. Sometimes it's just clear that they're locked into a disposition of that kind to reject any particular rational argument that is presented to them. And again, there's just no point in arguing with them. And putting this a bit more generally, I think one could just say that some people may simply put themselves beyond saving. I mean, they reject the kinds of cognition that are needed to answer philosophical questions, and they, as it were, they reject any kind of help that we try to give them. And at some point, we just have to say, well, that's their problem, not ours. And I mean, the important moral is that we shouldn't assess philosophical positions by their capacity to persuade anybody who comes along, no matter how skeptical their dispositions. So I think it's worth considering how the same kind of issues would play out in natural science. And I mean, it seems plausible that someone who, in a similar sort of way, rejected non-deductive reasoning, they might simply exile themselves from natural science. I mean, because they're just not willing to do the kind of thinking that it takes to participate and in particular, that they might reject abductive argument, and they might not simply reject abductive argument because they don't like that way of understanding what's going on with non-deductive arguments. But if they're also rejecting any kind of non-deductive alternatives, such as probabilistic Bayesian reasoning, again, this scientist may be just too close to rejecting rational argument altogether to be worth arguing with. So this is not, it's not that philosophy is in any distinctive way, as it were, dogmatic in a way that, say, scientists aren't. I think, in fact, philosophy is, on the whole, is remarkable for how extreme the positions are that it's willing to take seriously. But I think it's just a much more general feature of inquiry that it can't engage all forms of skepticism. That even if we try to be very accommodating in any kind of inquiry, there will be forms of skepticism which are so extreme that we really don't have anything much to say to a skeptic of that kind. And I don't think we should, as it were, be wasting our time trying to persuade them, but beyond a certain point. And I don't think we have to think badly of whatever theories we're sympathetic to, because those theories don't give us the resources to convince skeptics. That's just not a reasonable standard to be applying. So those are some not fully systematic just comments about the kind of role that deduction plays in philosophical argument. I'm going to say more later, but I think it might be helpful just to stand back a little bit from the case of philosophy and continue thinking about how things work in the comparable case I've suggested in previous lectures of natural science, and in particular to ask what role or roles does deduction play in natural science. So I think the thing to say is, the first thing to say is that in natural science, deduction is typically used in arguing from theories rather than to them. That's to say that we shouldn't expect to deduce a theory from nothing or from premises that don't themselves constitute a theory. Of course, if we've got one theory, sometimes you can deduce another theory from it, e.g. in the case where one theory unifies a number of more specific theories. But if we're thinking about how we get to two theories in the first place in natural science, it will typically not be by deducing them. But nevertheless, deduction does play an important role because we can deduce things from theories. So predictions are deduced from theories plus auxiliary assumptions. And if the predictions are falsified, the theory is also falsified, at least given those auxiliary assumptions, for example, assumptions about how the measurement devices are working or whatever it happens to be. But if the predictions are verified, the theory is abductively confirmed. So that deduction is playing a role within abduction and within an abductive methodology. And of course, it may, in falsification, it may, well, at least in a very simple version of falsification, it's also playing a more direct role in the rejection of theories. And so I think it's worth exploring the idea that the role of deduction in philosophy is similar to that in natural science, and well, both that it is similar, but an alternative view would be that it ought to be similar, even if it isn't. So, I mean, it might seem a bit strange to talk about philosophical theories as making predictions, but as long as one understands what a prediction is in a sufficiently broad sense, it makes sense. So, for example, if we have, let's say, a theory of justice, it may predict that a particular type of act is unjust. And in particular, of course, what goes on in thought experiments has some of this structure, that if we imagine a certain case, and then it might be that that a theory of justice will predict that what, let's say, the judge did in that case was unjust. And so really what we're talking about is simply deducing the consequences for specific cases from some kind of universal principle or theory that embodies maybe a number of universal principles. Now, one reason why you might resist calling those predictions is that the prediction itself involves the notion of justice by saying that the act type is not just, and so if you had a kind of stereotype of scientific predictions as being ones which are in purely sensory terms, I mean, maybe if you had these as purely sensory terms of, as it were, colors and shapes and so on, then the prediction, the judgment that an act type is unjust wouldn't count as a prediction in that sense. But that sense doesn't really correspond even to what goes on in science. I mean, predictions are not normally cast in terms of as it were, pure sensory qualities. They're cast in terms of, what value a certain physical variable will have, and that's something that has to be itself determined by making measurements which depend on various theoretical assumptions about how the measurement device works, and so on. And I mean, really, what we're doing in these cases is we're drawing on the fact that we have some capacity to judge particular cases that doesn't already assume the very kind of question, the very kind of theory that we're taking for granted, and that's not so implausible in the case of something like justice, that we have some capacity to judge whether particular acts are just or unjust, without deducing that from a general theory of justice. That the general theory of justice comes later, but we already have some kind of knowledge of particular cases that we can sometimes recognize injustice when we see it, even though we can't provide yet a general theory of justice. And it seems like victims of injustice are often aware that they are victims of injustice without being able to articulate any kind of theory that would explain why what they're suffering is injustice. So the we need to actually say a little bit more about the relation between logic and scientific theories, because they're actually quite closely bound up with each other. So we're using the basic logical principles in deducing predictions from a scientific theory, and they're actually part of the package which gets abductively confirmed when the theory is abductively confirmed. So, for example, if one very general type of inference which we have to use a lot in deriving predictions from general theories is the inference of universal instantiation, going from every f is g to this f is g. And logical principles like that, they're used to unpack the content of scientific theories, and so they're actually quite hard to separate from the scientific theories themselves, because it seems as it were we need them even to say what the theory itself is saying, what its content is. But that's actually exactly the same for unpacking the content of philosophical theories, so that the logical principles are difficult to separate from the philosophical theories. And in fact, sometimes people talk about a theory as just being not just the first, as it were, the whatever the basic laws of the theory, but the set of them and all their logical consequence, that the whole of that set would be the theory. And so, as it were, in some sense, we're bundling up together the logic and let's say the scientific laws or the philosophical principles into a single package. But that is okay from the point of view of abductive argument, because it's the whole package that is getting confirmed. So, of course, usually, we're in natural science, we are relying on the same logical principles, whichever particular, for example, physical theory we're using, and so those principles they're not particularly threatened when one of the theories is disconfirmed, because if one theory is disconfirmed, then we're likely to switch to another which is based on the same logical principles, and so we're typically not going to abandon those logical principles. That is the normal case, but there are one or two examples where that has been challenged. So, for example, Hilary Putnam argued that that the two slit experiments in quantum mechanics disconfirmed a distributive law of classical propositional logic, that from P and Q or R, we can go to P and Q or P and R. And I mean, this has to do with the principles of complementarity and the idea that you can't be completely specific in measuring as with two different complementary variables in a system. Now, I'm not concerned with the details of Putnam's argument, but he did propose that the best way to understand what is happening in these experiments is by rejecting this distributive law, and then, as it were, supposedly that would enable you to have a more realistic understanding of what's physically going on in the experiments. And I don't see anything that's in principle mistaken about that. Sorry, I don't see anything that's methodologically completely illegitimate about that kind of move in principle. I don't think there's any kind of transcendental argument that excludes making that move. I mean, in practice, this didn't work. I think it's fairly generally accepted that rejecting the distributive law does not help us understand what's physically happening in two-slit experiments. And indeed, Putnam himself later changed his mind and stopped supporting quantum logic. I mean, it's a complicated situation because sometimes what's going on when people advocate quantum logic is really just giving some kind of non-standard meaning to the or the word or the symbol for disjunction. In terms of the mathematical spaces that are involved in quantum mechanics. But if it was just changing the meaning of or, that would not be an interesting rejection of the distributive law. It would just be a verbal move. But I think Putnam didn't intend what he was making as a purely verbal move. But I don't think we can exclude in completely general principle the idea that laws of logic are part of what is being abductively confirmed or disconfirmed by prediction in the natural sciences. But it doesn't seem that we've actually facing any good example of that. So as I say, there's no decisive transcendental argument against revising logic for reasons derived from natural science. And then I think this is something that applies in philosophy as well. So this concerns the question of whether what kind of support that we have for classical logic itself, which is the logic that is mainly used by philosophers, and this goes back to one or two things that I was saying earlier in the lecture. Well, two things in particular. One was about the case where the philosopher was actually challenging the logic of the argument, complaining that the argument, although it might be valid by the standards of, let's say, classical logic, those standards are wrong. And another case was where, well, or maybe a special case of that is the case where, in fact, there are no premises. We just have a conclusion which is a logical truth according to classical logic, but then it still might be challenged by someone who wanted to challenge classical logic itself. And as I've emphasized, this challenge to the logical aspect the argument. It doesn't go away when we go abductive, because we've also got to consider the role of classical or whatever logic it is that we're using in deriving predictions from the theory. And so we get to a very different theoretical package depending on which logic we use to combine with, let's say, some basic postulated physical laws to derive their consequences. So obviously, if we're thinking about the status of classical logic here, we're not going to look for a deductive argument for classical logic, because, well, if that uses classical logic, it seems in some sense that it's question begging. But if we're looking for abductive support for classical logic, then it's very easy to find, because classical logic plays an absolutely central role in mathematics. I mean, the mathematics as it's actually developed over the centuries and the millennia. And mathematics, with the central role that it has for proof, and proof by classical standards, it's the most successful deductive enterprise in human history, and, if you like, in terrestrial history. And so it provides massive support for classical logic, because it's almost entirely been done by classical logic. It's not that people have never proposed alternatives, and even as in the case of intuitionistic logic, to some extent developed mathematics along those lines, but those are very, from the overall point of view, those are pretty minor and somewhat marginal events in the history of mathematics compared to the role of classical logic in standard mathematics. And given how successful mathematics has been, both in itself and in its applications in science, it seems that we've got very strong abductive support for classical logic. And it's classical logic is both, it has its usual abductive virtues, that it's a very strong logic. I mean, most of the alternative logics that get considered are logics which weaken classical logic by not going for the full classical principles rather than being stronger logics. And at the same time, classical logic is an extremely simple logic. So it's really a paradigm of strong abductive support. So I'm going to say something about now about the connection between logic and philosophy, where we start thinking of logic as simply a part of philosophy. And we've already seen some movement in that direction, because we saw that when you put forward a philosophical theory with some philosophical generalizations, I mean, you need some kind of logic to derive consequences from those generalizations, and without the consequences, these generalizations that they tell you very little, and of course one effect of that is that they're not then capable of getting abductive support, because they're not making, they wouldn't be making, without the logic, they wouldn't be making the predictions that can be independently verified. Now, I mean, one way in which some philosophers and indeed some logicians have thought about the role of logic in metaphysics and in other parts of philosophy is as something like a kind of neutral umpire or referee that, as it were, was there to arbitrate between, let's say, competing theories in metaphysics or whatever it happened to be, but which by itself didn't have any particular metaphysical or other substantive content. And of course, if you only consider classical logic, it can look as very like that, as if classical logic is the only one that is that anybody's combining with a philosophical theory. Then it, as it were, if everybody is in practice accepting classical logic, then it looks philosophically neutral. But it isn't really neutral, because even if, in fact, everybody has been accepting it, it is possible to reject classical logic, and to reject it on philosophical grounds, for example, metaphysical grounds, so that it's not as though this is a referee that all the metaphysicians can just accept as neutral. And in fact, if you think about principles of logic, virtually everyone has been rejected by some philosophers on metaphysical grounds, also on other non-metaphysical but philosophical grounds, but let's consider the metaphysical ones. So, I mean, here are just some classic examples to think about. So, I mean, probably the most famous contestable principle of classical logic is the law of excluded middle. I mean, the principle that either something is the case or it's not the case. And so, well, one way in which that's been contested is in relation to the open future. So, in other words, if we're dealing with let's say some future contingency, and a famous example is Aristotle's of the sea battle tomorrow, where it could be a sea battle, but there could also not be a sea battle, and then many philosophers have thought that applying excluded middle to such future contingents gave you incorrect results. So that if you say either there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or it's not the case that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, that you're saying something which in some way is incorrect, because whether there will be one or not is undetermined, and so somehow the disjunction fails, and so that's one kind of metaphysical ground on which people have rejected the law of excluded middle. Another kind is constructivism in the philosophy of mathematics, where, well, this involves some kind of epistemological grounds, but which are somehow built into the conception of the nature of mathematical objects, that mathematical objects are only, in some sense, mental constructs, and that they're only determined insofar as we've written rules for their construction which determine things one way or the other, and so we're putting it very, very crudely, that if our rules haven't determined things either way, then we can't say that they're either one way or the other. And so that kind of constructivist picture of the metaphysics of mathematics has led to rejections of the law of excluded middle. And then there's what is perhaps not very helpfully known as the law of non-contradiction, which is, you could think of as a ban on asserting any contradictions. And dialetheists like Graham Priest and others who I mentioned earlier, they do assert contradictions. So they reject the rejection of contradictions. And I mean, one kind of case where they do that is with paradoxes such as the paradox of the liar, the semantic paradoxes of truth and falsity, and paradoxes of vagueness sometimes, and also in set theory, the Russell's paradox of the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. And so the idea is that as it were, there are kind of singularities, a bit like black holes in logical space, where things go wrong and contradictions hold. And they've developed a view of logical space on which it's subject to these kind of black holes. And it's even been claimed that any kind of change involves somehow a contradiction. I mean, I should add that I'm not endorsing any of these objections to classical logic, but the interesting thing is that they're made and they can't simply be rejected as it were from the discussion altogether. And so so that for example, Graham Priest would say that the Russell set, in other words, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, the Russell set both is and is not a member of itself. I mean, he doesn't assert all contradictions, but as well, the idea is that there are these particular singularities where contradictions hold. And then maybe an even more extreme case, it concerns the reflexivity of identity, which is just a principle that everything is identical with itself. And I mean, that's often thought of by people brought up within analytic philosophy as a claim that's so trivial that nobody could possibly reject it. But a philosopher I know who was in a department with a lot of non-analytic philosophers was surprised to find that many of them thought that nothing was identical with itself, and I think again their idea was that somehow the phenomenon of change of a thing having, let's say, being sitting at one time and standing at another or whatever it was, that involves some kind of lack of self identity, because the object has inconsistent properties at different times. So again, my own view is that these are some confused objections that, but nevertheless, there are alternative views of the metaphysics which do involve these rejections of classical principles. And of course, we also saw earlier in the lecture that that people have rejected both the rule of Modus Ponens, the one that goes from P and if P then Q to the conclusion Q, and the distributivity law, which Putnam was rejecting in the case of quantum mechanics. So it seems that pretty much whatever logical principle you think of, it can be rejected on metaphysical grounds. And of course, the fact that somebody might reject it on metaphysical grounds doesn't mean that it's actually wrong. But it does mean that these logical principles don't have the kind of neutral arbiter status that is often claimed for them. I mean, sometimes what you get are people who in fact, they take one of these classical laws and they see that it's not neutral. And then even though they don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but they say that it shouldn't be a law of logic because logic is supposed to be neutral. And so that it might, as it were, be a law of metaphysics, but not a law of logic. And they make that sound a reasonable kind of move by only making it once. But once you look at the range of cases in which we get these classical principles being rejected on metaphysical grounds, I think you can see that if we exclude all those principles which are going to fail to be philosophically neutral because it's possible to reject them on metaphysical grounds or some other substantive philosophical grounds, we're just not going to have any logical principles left at all. And so the standard of neutrality that philosophers sometimes apply to logical principles is just a completely unreasonable one, and so it makes more sense to think of the logic as itself part of the philosophy, so that when somebody's putting forward a theory in philosophy, the part of what is being put forward is the logic that they're using to articulate this theory, which usually is classical logic, but it can very well be some non-classical logic. And there isn't anything, as it were, that's methodologically excluded about that, because logic just doesn't have this kind of neutral status. And well, I'll just briefly say something about another kind of example, because in this case the metaphysical content is fairly explicit. So this is a dispute that involves both quantified modal logic and modal metaphysics. So it's a dispute between the view, which actually I like, called necessitism, that necessarily everything is necessarily something, and contingentism, which is a view that possibly something is possibly nothing. And let me just unpack these a little bit so that you get the feel of the two positions. So if we use the term existence just for being something or other, not particularly for being concrete or anything, but just to be something, then necessitism is the view that existence is non-contingent, whereas contingentism is the view that existence is contingent. So that, in other words, the contingentist thinks that that what exists could have been different, could have been otherwise, the facts about existence, whereas the necessitist thinks that they could not have been otherwise. And I mean, the reason I like this case is because in this example, actually, I mean, both necessitism and contingentism are consistent with, at the non-modal level, with classical logic, but they correspond to a very different view of what modal reality is like, and each of them can be formulated as just by a formula that in a broad sense contains only logical constants, so that as it were only things that we're treating as constant for the purposes of discussion. So that the necessitism, the two boxes or squares that you see there, they just stand for metaphysical necessity. It couldn't be otherwise. And then we have the quantifiers, the upside down A and the backward E, which I'm understanding as ranging over just whatever there is, without any kind of restriction, which is in a way the purest kind of logical interpretation of them. And then identity is also a logical constant. And so if you think of a logical truth as one which is true no matter how we vary the interpretation of the non-logical constants in it, the just ordinary predicates and names and so on. On a natural way of dividing the logical and non-logical constants, necessitism and contingentism, they're both expressed using no non-logical constants at all. They're just using modal operators for absolute metaphysical necessity. They're using unrestricted quantifiers, and they're using identity, and then the variables are just articulating that. And so on such a view, it would actually be the case that if either of necessitism is contingentism, if either is true, then it's going to be a logical truth because there's nothing to vary, and so it will, as it were, vacuously be true on however you vary the interpretation of the non-logical constants. And contingentism is actually just the negation of necessitism equivalently, and vice versa. So well, again, if we're assuming the classical propositional logic, then one of necessitism and contingentism is true, and whichever is true is a logical truth. And yet it seems that both of these views are very, very far from metaphysically neutral. I mean, each of them involves a specific conception of modal reality, but one conception is the negation of the other. So this is a case where what, in a sense, is just part of the logic of metaphysical modality and existence and identity is going to be a very non-neutral logical truth. So on this understanding of the logic, that as where the logic is by itself is going to be telling us something of metaphysical interest. So on the view that I've been suggesting, logic forms the central structural core of a well-developed metaphysics. So that it, as well, it's not some neutral auxiliary that you combine with the metaphysical view. It is a foundational part of the metaphysical view itself, and so it's natural that it's the logic that is being abductively confirmed or disconfirmed, along with the rest of the metaphysics, and that's because, as I said, there really isn't any proper way of making out the idea that the logic is metaphysically neutral. There's no way of extracting some kind of basic core of logical principles which are not metaphysically contested. So where does this leave us? On the one hand, I'm suggesting that logic plays a role as giving us a bunch of metaphysically significant claims in their own right. In the modal case, it will give us either necessitism or contingentism, and even something as apparently trivial as the law of the reflexivity of identity, that everything is self-identical, is not a metaphysically neutral claim. It's a claim about identity that plays a foundational role in what I would think of as the sensible metaphysics of identity, and is denied in some others. So, I mean, that's one aspect of the role of logic. We also have the role of logic in articulating the consequences of metaphysical principles, in the same way as logic plays a role in articulating the consequences of putative physical laws within a physical theory. And these are two somewhat different roles, because the role in articulating the consequences of other theoretical principles is one which is typically played by rules of inference, which are, for example, a rule that allows us to infer from a universal generalization to its instances. Whereas the the previous role of actually stating metaphysically significant truths, or what are claimed to be truths, is not so much concerned with the rules of inference, but with the logical truths. But these two things in the end are all bound up together in a fully articulated logic. So those are two central roles for logic to play in philosophical theorizing. The role of stating some basic structural principles about reality, and the role of articulating the consequences of other sorts of principle. And both of those are part of the package of, for example, a metaphysical theory or another kind of philosophical theory, which can then be abductively confirmed or disconfirmed in terms of its consequences. And whereas in some areas, the only theory that's being, the only logic that's being considered for any of the rival theories is classical logic. In philosophy, over the past century, there's been considerable attention has been paid to alternatives to classical logic, and so they're playing a much more active role in abductive confirmation and disconfirmation than they do in science and mathematics, where at least where no alternatives to them are being considered. Of course, even in those cases, classical logic does get some credit as part of the package, which has been abductively successful, if we are getting a lot of abductive success. But in the case of philosophy, the differences between these theories get much more actively assessed, because we are in fact taking into consideration various non-classical alternatives, at least some of the time. And I might say my own view is that it's classical logic that comes out as by far superior in these cases, and that the typical problem with non-classical logics is that they're so weak that they really don't enable very much in the way of consequences to be drawn from theories based on them, and as a result, those theories do rather poorly by abductive considerations. So those are the kinds of role that deductive logic plays in the theory assessment in philosophy, and it plays an active role in the abductive comparison of philosophical theories. And I think, that is enough to give deductive logic an extremely important role in philosophy. But I think what it doesn't really play the kind of role that it's presented as having in a lot of the way that philosophers talk about what they're doing, where they dress up their arguments in deductive terms, but where the philosophical action is occurring somewhere else, because we never really get a satisfactory account of the status of the non-logical premises. And so I think there's something rather I mean, maybe sometimes convenient in presenting philosophical arguments in deductive terms, but it's somewhat misleading because it's really it doesn't relate very naturally to the way in which the theories at issue are actually being assessed or should actually be assessed, which is an abductive one. So just to say what I'm going to be doing next time. So quite often in these last 6 lectures, we've been looking back to episodes in the history of philosophy, and I was doing that just now in the case of episodes in the history of philosophical logic, in proposals for the modification of classical logic of one kind or another, such as Putnam's. So, on the whole, fairly recent ones, although I think issues about the role of the excluded middle and the open future go back much further than that, and so that makes it natural to ask about how big a role can the past of philosophy help us in building the future of philosophy. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williamson. Yes, now I give a very short introduction to the interlocutor and questioner. Dr. Zhang Liuhua is a full professor of philosophy at East China Normal University, and she specializes in logic, philosophy of logic, history of logic, especially Charles Peirce and American pragmatism. Dr. Chu Min is an associate professor, philosophy school of Huazhong University of Science and Technology. He specializes in metaphysics, philosophy of logic, and philosophy of language. So it's your turn, Zhang Liuhua and Shu Min. Okay.
Okay. Thanks for Professor Chambers organizing this event and introducing me. Also, thanks for Professor Williamson's lecture. As any other lecture you gave last month, this is an informative and illuminating talk. It's Professor, can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I'll continue.
Yeah.
It's a succinct and a state-of-art explanation about philosophical method. And in understanding the main points of Professor Williamson's lectures, I can't help think of Charles and Peirce relevant thought many times. For instance, Peirce's critical commonsensism, his classification of the senses, and his pragmatism as the logic of abduction. I point out these interesting similarities, but do not mean that you follow the footprint of Peirce. Actually, it is not hard to find some important differences between you and Peirce. One interesting case is that you conceive simplicity of theory as aesthetical criterion, but Peirce treats it as one of economic consideration. Despite this, the most impressive things for me are those common insights between you and Peirce. Evidently, you are not alone in holding these seemingly unorthodox views about the philosophy, not only today, but only in history. I myself really appreciate these claims and have learned much from your distinctive construal and the justification of them. In the following, I want to ask two what-is questions and one question about justification. The three questions all relate to abduction in some way. They contain some aspects which I have a main concern over and expect Professor Williamson to say a little more about. First question, what is a logic in modern sense? Yes, in contemporary academia, such a question tends to be discarded as merely verbal dispute. However, Professor Williamson's repeated emphasis on the role of abduction in science, philosophy, and logic makes me feel that it is worth knowing in a clear way what a logic is, or at least what Professor Williams means by a logic. As a modern discipline, logic appears both as a branch of mathematics and as part of philosophy. In line with this, the word logic is mainly used as a formalized system. I think when you set off classical logic, quantum logic, and other non-classical logics, you are using the word logic in this sense. Apart from this, you seem to have used the word in other sense. E.g., classical logic concerns the logic of not and all, every, some, and is. What do you mean by the logic of not and other particles? In one case, it seems to mean the actual usage of these particles. In another case, it seems to mean how we should use these particles, how we did use them. In the third case, it may mean that some people or community just want to employ these particles in a specific way. I also noticed that even though you emphasize the indispensable role of abduction in philosophical method, you did not use the phrase abductive logic or the logic of abduction. Possibly, there is a difference between using abduction in doing logic and studying abduction in a logical way. Does this mean that you would like to say, like Popper, that there's not a logic of induction at all? Or to say, like Carnap, that the matter of abduction falls within methodology of logic, but not logic proper? In view of all this, I hope Professor Williamson can give a further clarification about how you'd like to use the word logic. Next question, what is an inference argument reasoning? Here, I assume that there is no substantial difference between the three words, and I take it that Professor Williamson did not distinguish them conceptually in today's talk. There is a traditional thought about logic. It takes that the subject matter of logic is inference, and the types of inference include deduction and abduction. This picture is customary and seemingly natural. However, there is a great difference between deduction and abduction. The premises of deduction are just assumptions, something you take or pretend to be true. However, the premises of abduction are beliefs or evidence. Perhaps mainly because modern logicians and analytic philosophers notice the above difference. Some of them tend to exclude abduction from inference proper. As a consequence, there is only deductive logic, but no abductive logic. Even though in some circumstances we must accept the existence of probable inference, the only intangible part in the probable inference is just something like Bayesian probabilities, the latter being kind of probable deduction, a subtype of deduction, but not a new kind of inference. On the other hand, some philosophers cherish a different conception of inference. Harman argued that inference is, in nature, reasoned change in view, the paradigmatic case of which is abduction, but not deduction. What is important in deduction is implication, but not inference in the sense of belief religion. So, although obviously there is deductive proof, it is not similarly obviously that there is deductive inference. Thereby, a seemingly surprising conclusion is that logic in modern sense is not theory of inference. Even though modern logic has something to do with our reasoning, that does not mean that it is especially relevant to reasoning. Its relevance being not more than physics is relevant to reasoning. Now, we have seen that there is a dispute over which is the paradigm of inference. I expect you to say something about this verbal dispute. You have taken it for granted that abduction is non-deductive inference and argued with effort for the role of abduction in logic. However, one skeptic might say, why make a fuss about abduction? In the sense, it's just observation or perception, good gesture or hypothesis, or some sort of practical considerations, or at best, something like Goodman's reflective equilibrium. And undoubtedly, there is something to abduction, but that does not mean that we should extol it as a new kind of inference, because as mentioned earlier, there seems to be a difference of quality, not just of degree, between deduction and abduction. I want to know how Professor Williamson would respond to this line. The last question, is there a hope that we can justify abductively that classical logic is the best or most robust logic among a variety of modern logics? When you said that quantum logic, intuitionistic logic, and per-consistent logic are not crazy or are intelligible, I understand that you took a tolerant attitude towards the phenomenon of logical pluralism. But some advocates of non-classical logic seek much more than being understood in the spirit of Carnap's tolerance. They aspire to show that some non-classical logic must be a better logic than classical logic, or even the only correct logic. Certainly, you have argued against them, but do you have the confidence to justify by an abductive methodology the correctness of classical logic? You seem to emphasize that the cost of revising classical logic is too big and the benefits of staying within classical logic is always great. But when we use this kind of cost-benefit analysis, should not we have in mind our purpose in choosing logic? I suspect that you and some advocates of non-classical logic did not agree on the purpose of doing logic. Some of claimed purposes may include evaluating arguments in ordinary and scientific languages, characterizing logical utterance in a systematic way, explaining by models how our actual arguments about something in some situation are sound or unsound, providing foundations of mathematical thinking, and so on. So you may probably get a result of cost-benefit analysis, which is very different from theirs. I guess you have taken classical logic as a kind of knowledge, but many people tend not to treat it as common sense knowledge, especially considering the paradoxes of material implication and the principle of explosion, EFQ, and others. So there seems to be a sense in which classical logic needs a reasonable justification. But the question is, will we make it hopefully, given that we can't conduct real-life experiments about any logic's predictable experiential effects, and more importantly, given that there's no great upon account of which data competing logical theory must explain. Maybe, as some pessimists would like to suggest, classical logic as today's standard logic is just one of human conventions in the process of social evolution. That's all my comments and questions. Thank you. Professor Chen, I'm done.
So Professor Williamson will make comment, or just I will ask the question directly. Professor Chen. Okay, so then I will go to the questions directly. Thank you, Professor, for giving us such a great lecture about the most general philosophical methodology, and especially the relationship between logic, philosophy, and science. It's concerning quite general and abstract topics. But I can't distinguish which sources are yours and which are just generally accepted by the philosophy circle. You are just making an introduction. So I will ask 3 questions very briefly and ask for your own views. And the first question is about the so-called infinite regress of the deductive model of philosophical argument. Do you think this is a big cost or disadvantage of the model? Since I feel this model is not obviously wrong, even if it involves such infinite regrets. If I admit only deductive argument in philosophy, then I must say an ultimate argument for precision must involve infinite regrets. But this seems not a disaster. Since for some pragmatic reason, we can choose not to argue further. We can stop at some level or at some point. For example, we can stop at where we have shared common sense. Or we can stop at where the level is deep enough for some pragmatic reason. In short, my first question is, do you think the infinite regress here is a vicious regress? This is the first question. And the second question, if I understand your view correctly, you think that the right model for philosophical argument can be described as deductive plus abductive. If so, then a question is why it is not deductive plus inductive, or deductive plus abductive and plus inductive. Do you think that deductive reasoning and abductive reasonings are 2 basic kinds of reasoning, but inductive reasoning is not? As you say that Professor John also talked about this point. Or you think that both 3 kinds of reasonings are basic, but inductive reasoning is not used or not often used in philosophy? This is the second question. And third question, if the right model of philosophical argument is deductive plus abductive, then this seems implying that the case would be different for arguments in other fields, such as economics, physics, psychology, etc. So the question is, do you have such an implication? Do you really think that the model for philosophical argument should be different to that for arguments in other fields? Or logic is neutral and can be applied universally to all fields, no matter deductive logic or non-deductive logic? If I can ask more question, we do not have too much time. If I can ask one more question, I hope you can talk about the inference to best explanation, that is IBE. After all, for many philosophers, IBE is the most important methodology for philosophy. And for some philosophers, maybe this is the own valuable methodology in philosophy. So we all know that IBE is abductive in some science, but they are not exactly the same. So if you can talk more about IBE, I will appreciate so much. Thank you, Professor Williams. This is all my questions.
Okay, very good.
Right. Well, thank you both for those good questions. I think there are quite a few points to talk about. First of all, with Zhonglu Ha's questions. So the first of them was about the relation between logic and abduction, and the first part of that, I think, was to do with the relation between logic in relation to formal systems and logic in relation to natural language. So, of course, the term logic is used very widely for a number of different kinds of inquiry, and so one can just do the metalogic of various uninterpreted formal systems, and I mean that's in effect a branch of mathematics. And in fact, I mean, that is done. There's quite a lot of that in when people are studying modal logic. Often they're looking at modal systems without any particular interpretation of the modal operators in mind. But I've been talking today not about the logic of the metalogic of uninterpreted formal systems, but when I've been talking about the word formalized logic, I've still been thinking of the logical constants as interpreted symbols which with a meaning, and so it's not so distant from the logic in relation to ordinary to natural language, where we also are dealing with interpreted symbol, and so there's a question about how far there can be well, there is divergence between the logical particles in natural language and those that we're looking at in classical formal systems. It's not part of what I'm concerned to argue that they have to match each other perfectly, and I mean, so if we take something like the conditional, the if it turned out that the conditionals in natural language had a different meaning from, let's say, the material implication in a language. I mean, that wouldn't necessarily mean that there was anything wrong with their meaning in natural language, and it wouldn't necessarily mean that we should somehow be forced to use them differently. I mean, I do, as a matter of fact, think that the reference of the logical particles in natural language does match up quite well to the corresponding symbols in a classical formal language, and in particular in my most recent book, I have defended the interpretation of if in natural language as the equivalent to the material implication in classical logic, but that's not central to the points that I've been making about philosophical methodology. As it would not be a disaster for them if there was a divergence between the natural languages and formal languages, and it might be that in certain respects the expressions that we have in a formal language are better suited to doing systematic theorizing than those that we have in natural language. As I say, in fact, I think that the ones we have in natural language are already up to the task. But the idea that in certain respects we should be expressing our logical theories in a formal language, I'm not hostile to if it makes things more precise. And for example, I'm sympathetic to higher order logics which are not really very well expressed in a natural language, and so if we want to use a formal language there to give a canonical expression to our logical theories, that strikes me as a reasonable thing to do. On the question of whether there's a logic of abduction, I'm not hostile to that idea in principle, but it's not that there's enough formal structure there to give us anything terribly interesting. So I think that takes me on to your second question, which had to do with contrast between abduction and deduction, and how that relates to the sort of Harmon point about the difference between inference, a cognitive transition that agents make, and arguments in the sense of things, premises, and conclusions. So one respect in which you were drawing a contrast had to do with the idea that with deduction, the proofs are just the premises are just treated as suppositions, and then the conclusion is drawn from them without, as it were, any commitment to the premises. Whereas in abduction, the premises are treated as beliefs or evidence, and therefore as something where that are already endorsed. I'm a bit skeptical about that as a fundamental difference between abduction and deduction, even though it's true that they're often talked about in that kind of way. But in the case of deduction, quite often people, when they're talking about deductive argument, they just have the case in mind of deductive argument from things that we already believe. and then they're more, and then they may, as it were, grudgingly admit that there's also deductive argument from suppositions rather than beliefs. I think in the case of abduction, we're less used to the idea of abduction from suppositions, but I think it does actually make sense that we can do some kind of abductive reasoning from suppositions. So we can, for example, we sometimes say things like, if he didn't come to the party, that was because blah, 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 blah. And that if-then statement is itself based on some kind of abductive reasoning from a supposition, not the belief, that that he wasn't at the party. And then, as it were, under that supposition, an abductive reasoning to why he wouldn't have been at the party. And then since we can make the transition from the supposition to the conclusion about why he wasn't at the party, with that, and it then entitles us to assert the additional, if he wasn't at the party, then it was because of so-and-so. And so I think we can do this kind of suppositional reasoning even with abduction. And I agree that, I do think that the Harman distinction between inference and argument is important, but I think we can make something of that distinction on both the abductive and the deductive sides. And as I say, that each of them can be done in relation to suppositions as well as to belief. One specific point I want to make is that I definitely don't want to think of abduction in terms of reflective equilibrium, because reflective equilibrium is a kind of an internalist conception of what's going on. It just has to do with coherence, internal coherence, rather than a relation to evidence that actually, evidence has to be true on my view. So that I don't want to characterize abduction in terms of reflective equilibrium. So I don't think the contrast is as great as you're suggesting, and I think we can, we give suppositional versions of both abduction and deduction. We can also give a version where we're combining that kind of reasoning with some assumptions about the premises as believed or as evidence or whatever, and something that is closer to a theory of belief change. Your third question was to do with how good a classical, how good an abductive case there is for classical logic, and actually, I'm pretty confident of that. And the thing is, you were suggesting that maybe different logics might arise depending on what tasks we expected our logics to perform, and that has on the whole, not been my experience with philosophical advocates of non-classical logics. I mean, sometimes people put forward a certain non-classical logic as just the logic that you'd get if you had a certain model theory or something very limited and formal like that. But my experience with advocates in philosophy of non-classical logic is that they're putting them forward as things which are better equipped than classical logic to do a full range of tasks, because we in ways that I was partly bringing out in the discussion, we expect logics to do more than one thing for us. I think that one big issue has been the role of mathematics, but the way that advocates of non-classical logics usually handle that is saying that the particular problems that they're talking about for as reasons for abandoning classical logic in full generality typically they say that not in all cases, not true with intuitionists, but they say that these problems don't arise in mathematics, and therefore it's okay to use a classical logic, a special case of mathematics, even though it's not valid according to them more widely. And I think that typically that involves a mistaken view as to what's involved in applying mathematics. And I mean, I don't have time to go into the details here, but when you look at how mathematics gets applied to in natural science and social science and elsewhere, it then has to be applied. When we apply it, we start we're instantiating mathematical theorems in relation to physical and social reality, and then as it were, the phenomena that lead to restrictions on classical logic arise within that reality, and so the idea that you can somehow insulate classical logic from the reasons that people have given for going non-classical, I think doesn't work, and therefore typically these non-classical logics they are actually in trouble in making sense of mathematics. And I certainly do not think of logic as in any way a human convention or something like that. I mean, logic is it's a human convention that.
水明，你把你的那个视频关掉，音响，关掉，你那里很多。
How long have I been muted for?
Yeah.
When did it? Have I been muted for all the time I've been talking? Or was I just
continue your talking? Yes. Sorry. You continue your talking. I just said some noise from somewhere. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were hearing me before.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. So I don't think of logic as a human convention. It's a human convention that words like and or if not mean what they do, but then it's given that they have those meanings, which things are true involving them. It's not up to us to decide, and if I think it would be very, very hard to understand how logic can work in, for example, in natural science, if we thought that these were just human conventions in some sense, other than the sense in which all of language is a human convention, and just because it's humans who give meanings to our words. Okay, so those are my brief responses to Zhonglu Ha. I mean, of course, there's lots more to be said, and now I'll answer Xiumin's questions. So, as I understand, so the first question was: is the problem of an infinite regress serious in philosophy? And I mean, I completely agree with him that the fact that in principle there's this infinite regress doesn't mean that in practice such deduction has to be useless, because often in practice, in ordinary life, we can just find some shared premises and then deductively argue from them. Not that deduction plays a very large role in ordinary life, but when it does, so that we, as it were, we it's not that the problem, the issue in principle of an infinite regress has to be vicious, but the point that I was worrying about was basically this: that in philosophical disputes, each side argues against the other in a deductive way, very often in philosophy, but at the same time, they don't make progress because they never find premises that are shared, and it's always actually quite easy for the other side to reject some of their premises, so that that we don't have the conditions which make the regress a virtuous one, because we don't get back to shared premises, and I think that as we're so that philosophical dispute is often rather distorted and sent in a somewhat unproductive direction, because, as it were, people are reasoning as though what their job was to find some kind of knockdown argument against the other side, even though they kind of know that is not a realistic expectation. And so I think it would be more productive for us to argue in a way which is closer to the kind of support that is actually being offered for controversial philosophical positions, which is typically not thought of as deductive in any useful way, but as something more like abductive support. So the second question was about with sort of abductive plus deductive model of reasoning. So I should say that's not really my preferred way of thinking about the kind of support that philosophical positions have. My preferred way is a fully abductive conception of what's going on, where the role of deduction is much more just in drawing the consequences of the philosophical theory in question, in order to, as it were, to roughly speaking, to make predictions which then can be confirmed. So I wasn't actually advocating that hybrid view. I was just considering it as a kind of one possibility that people might go to starting from the deductive model. But I think that the deductive model itself is often not very helpful. But I think then the second part of your second question was, the other aspect of it was about what role induction might play here. So I've, at least for the sake of simplicity, I've been arguing with the tacit assumption that induction can be subsumed under abduction in something like the way that Gilbert Harman recommends. I mean, he thinks that really, insofar as induction is a good way to argue, that its successes are really basically explained by abduction. And I mean, if that were wrong, then we might have to add induction as another kind of non-deductive argument in philosophy. I don't think induction is a very common philosophical method. I mean, if we're just talking about, as it were, simple induction, where we're, as it were, from many instances, but it's true that it's sometimes used in philosophy. For example, I mean, I've sometimes used it myself. For example, in suggesting that knowledge doesn't have an analysis into belief and truth and other components in the way that people have been looking for, because there's good inductive evidence that those analyses don't work. So it's not that I'm opposed to the use of induction, but my first pass view is that induction can be subsumed under abduction, and if it can't be, then we might have to add it to abduction. And I think what I said about that the sort of hybrid abduction plus deduction view is not really my view. I think that kind of answers question 3, which was about whether philosophy is different from other sciences because they don't follow that kind of combined, that abduction plus deduction model. So I think it's not so different from those other sciences, but its fundamental kind of arguments are not of this special hybrid sort. And then the fourth question was about, as I understood, was about the relation between inference to the best explanation and abduction. So there's quite a lot of discussion of that in the literature, and I know that a number of Peirce scholars think that inference to the best explanation does not really capture what Peirce was talking about as abduction. I've never found their explanations of the difference very illuminating. And of course, Peirce himself talks about abduction in many, many different ways. So I have not been drawing a systematic distinction between them. I mean, I guess somebody who thought that explanation wasn't a very clear term in philosophy, might want to talk about abduction rather than inference to the best explanation. But as I say, I have never really seen a very convincing account of what is meant to be the key difference between them. And my impression is that the majority of the philosophical community uses them more or less interchangeably, but there are certainly some people, particularly some Peirce scholars, maybe not all Peirce scholars, who want to distinguish them, and but often when they're distinguishing between them, they're using abduction for some rather more specific form of inference, or form of argument, which occasionally Peirce does talk about. And then I don't want to use the term abduction in that very specific way. I think it's too specific for what I need. So although I tend to use the term abduction, but I think you would not misunderstand me if you interpreted abduction in terms of inference to the best explanation when I've been using it. Okay, again, I know there's lots more to be said, but those are my responses to the questions. And thank you both for the good questions that you've been pushing me on.
Thank you, Professor Williamson. He presents a new image of logic, very new image of logic. It is not neutral. It is a part of philosophy. Can be challengeable by many different reasons. Philosophy is essentially abductive, maybe not detective. So his lecture is very informative and stimulating. I also, the Zhang Liuhua and Shu Min gave a very good question. So thank all of you three, Professor Williamson, Professor Zhang Liuhua, Professor Shu Min. Let's meet here on Thursday night. It will be very interesting topic, philosophy and history of philosophy. So stop here. Meet on Thursday night. Okay? Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
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 Thank you, Professor Williamson. Thank you, Professor Chin and Professor Zhang.
Thank you all.
Thank you.